The neon sign of the all-night diner hummed its usual electric lullaby against the freezing Michigan rain, casting long, familiar shadows across the cracked vinyl booths. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday night until Chase noticed the screen of Kennedy's phone lighting up on the counter. Not with a message from her sister, but a sheer, undeniable hotel address sent past midnight. A quiet, devastating truth was unraveling, right there under the flickering fluorescent lights. A secret too heavy for the cold morning air to hold. If these quiet fractures of the human heart and the weight of unspoken truths resonate with you, stay with me as we turn the page. The heavy glass door of Hank's 24/7 slammed shut, slicing off the sound of the relentless Detroit rain. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating aroma of burnt coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the lingering grease of 100 graveyard shifts. Chase Parker stood behind the stainless steel prep counter, pressing a damp towel against the back of his neck. His muscles ached with a dull, rhythmic throb that had long since become his default state of being. He watched the wall clock slowly tick past 3 in the morning. His shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but the dishwasher had broken down again, and the owner couldn't afford the overtime to have someone else fix it. Across the narrow aisle, Dan Williams was scraping the flat-top grill with a spatula, the harsh scraping sound echoing in the near-empty diner. Dan paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a scarred hand. "You look like hell, man. Go home. I'll finish the closing duties." "Almost done," Chase muttered, his voice gravelly from lack of use. He didn't want to look toward the third booth by the window, but his eyes betrayed him, drawn by the familiar magnetic pull. Kennedy was sitting there. She had come in an hour ago after finishing a brutal double shift at the department store, claiming the bus schedule had gotten messed up again. She looked beautiful, even under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights that usually made everyone look like a corpse. But there was a fragility to her posture tonight. She was staring out the rain-streaked window, her chin resting in her hand, utterly detached from the diner, from the smell of frying oil, and from him. She wore the navy blue blazer required by the cosmetic counter, a cheap polyester thing meant to look high-end. Chase untied his stained apron, tossing it into the canvas laundry bin. He poured 2 mugs of the remaining coffee, knowing it would taste like ash, and walked over to her booth. He slid into the cracked vinyl seat opposite her, pushing 1 mug across the laminate table. The ceramic scraped against the surface. Kennedy blinked, startling slightly as if waking from a deep sleep, and pulled her gaze away from the dark street. "Hey," she said softly, wrapping her cold hands around the mug. She didn't drink. "Hey yourself," Chase replied. He reached across the table, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against her knuckles. "Sorry to keep you waiting. The Hobart gave out again." "It's fine," she said, her voice devoid of its usual melodic cadence. She offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. A heavy silence settled between them, the kind of silence that had been quietly suffocating their cramped apartment for the last 6 months. It wasn't born of anger, but of a bone-deep exhaustion. They were drowning in utility bills, late rent notices, and the terrifying realization that they were running on a treadmill that was slowly speeding up. Chase studied her face. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, partially concealed by expensive concealer she got from the sample drawer at work. But there was something else too, a restless, nervous energy thrumming beneath her skin. On the table between them, her phone sat face up. Chase took a sip of the bitter coffee, his eyes involuntarily catching a sudden flash of light. The screen of Kennedy's phone illuminated the space between them. It wasn't a text from her sister Sarah, or an alert from the bank regarding an overdraft. It was a message preview. "Brock Steele, room 412 is booked for tomorrow night. Wear the red dress. You deserve better than that life." The world seemed to halt. The rhythmic scraping of Dan's spatula faded into static. The hum of the neon sign died in Chase's ears. Kennedy's hand shot forward with terrifying speed. She snatched the phone, flipping it face down so hard the plastic case clattered against the table. Her eyes darted to Chase, wide and suddenly entirely present. "Just work stuff," she breathed, her voice trembling just a fraction. "Inventory." Chase looked at her hand, pressed flat against the back of the phone, her knuckles turning white. He didn't scream. He didn't ask who Brock was, though the name immediately connected to the wealthy regional director she had casually mentioned weeks ago. He looked at the woman he had loved since they were 19, the woman he had promised to protect from the harshness of the world, and realized he was already a ghost in her eyes. "Right," Chase said quietly, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Inventory." He stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. "Let's go home, Kennedy." The air around the cosmetics counter always tasted faintly of chemical vanilla and crushed roses. Kennedy shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, biting the inside of her cheek to ignore the sharp, shooting pain radiating up her heel. Her navy blue polyester blazer felt like a straitjacket under the relentlessly buzzing halogen lights of the department store. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the wide, mirrored aisles were a ghost town of deeply discounted winter coats and profoundly bored mannequins. She glanced down at her phone, hidden discreetly behind the brass cash register. It was 2:15 p.m. The memory of Chase's hollow, defeated eyes at the diner the night before gnawed relentlessly at the edge of her conscience. "Let's go home, Kennedy." He hadn't said a single word on the drive back to their cramped apartment. He hadn't asked about the text message that had illuminated the space between them. That heavy, suffocating silence was infinitely worse than any screamed accusation. It was the silence of a man who was already mourning. "Thinking about tonight?" The voice was remarkably smooth, carrying the low, confident resonance of a man who never had to check the price tag before ordering. Kennedy's breath hitched in her throat. She looked up, her pulse instantly accelerating, to see Brock Steele leaning casually against her glass display case. He didn't belong in this dying suburban mall, and the stark contrast was jarring. His charcoal suit was undeniably custom-tailored, the Italian wool rich and matte, catching the harsh store light and somehow softening it. A heavy silver Rolex peeked out from beneath a crisp, perfectly pressed white cuff. In his hands, he held two artisan cups from the boutique coffee shop across the street. The one Kennedy could never justify spending $6 at. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice dropping an octave, instinctually adopting the formal, guarded tone she used when regional managers prowled the floor. But there were no other managers. They were entirely alone in the vast, sterile department. Brock smiled. It was a slow, deliberate curving of his lips that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He slid the flat white across the pristine glass counter. The cup stopped exactly an inch from her trembling fingertips. "I thought we agreed on Brock, Kennedy," he murmured, his dark eyes dropping momentarily to the cheap silver name tag pinned to her lapel. "You look completely exhausted. Have they been working you into the ground again?" She slowly wrapped her hands around the warm paper cup, letting the heat seep into her perpetually cold, lotion-stained skin. "It's just the mandatory inventory coming up. Everyone is tired." "Not everyone," he corrected smoothly, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer. The scent of his cologne, spiced sandalwood and expensive worn leather, effortlessly overpowered the synthetic floral smog of the department. "You shouldn't have to look so tired. A woman like you belong in a place that appreciates your beauty, not trapped behind a glass counter in a sinking ship." It was the exact same intoxicating script he had been quietly feeding her for weeks. Small, calculated validations. Drops of pure water for a woman dying of thirst in a desert of unpaid bills. Chase loved her. She knew that deeply. But Chase loved her with the grim, exhausting determination of basic survival. Chase saw her as a weary partner in their shared poverty. Brock, however, looked at her like she was a luxury. He reached out, his index finger slowly tracing the metallic edge of the glass counter, stopping just millimeters from her white knuckles. The physical proximity was electric, heavy with unspoken danger. "Room 412, Brock said quietly, his gaze locking onto hers, stripping away the playful charm to reveal a dark, magnetic intensity. 8 o'clock. I ordered that Cabernet you liked." Kennedy swallowed hard, the word no forming on the tip of her tongue. She thought of Chase's grease-stained hands. She thought of the pink final notice from the electric company currently sitting on their kitchen table. She thought of the relentless, gray years stretching out ahead of her if she stayed. "I have to close the register at 7, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the store's bland overhead music. "I'll be waiting," Brock replied. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He simply stepped back, offered a polite, professional nod for the benefit of a passing, oblivious security guard, and walked away. His expensive leather shoes made absolutely no sound on the cheap tile floor. Kennedy stood perfectly still, the paper cup burning her palms, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the air long after he was gone. She was standing on the absolute edge of a precipice, staring down into a dark, glittering unknown, realizing with a terrifying thrill that she was finally ready to jump. The rhythmic scraping of a Phillips head screwdriver against a stripped screw was the only sound in the suffocatingly small apartment. Chase sat on the peeling linoleum floor of their kitchen, wrestling with a cabinet door that had been hanging off its hinges for 3 months. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to fix something, anything, in a life that felt like it was rapidly unspooling out of his control. Down the narrow, shadowed hallway, the muffled rush of the bathroom shower provided a constant, rushing white noise. Kennedy had been in there for 20 minutes. She was washing away the synthetic floral scent of the department store, preparing for what she had earlier described, with forced casualness, as a late-night inventory shift. Chase's knuckles turned bone white as he tightened the screw. The silence between them had metastasized into something heavy and toxic since that night at the diner. Neither had mentioned the text message. Chase had convinced himself, during the desperate, pathetic hours of his graveyard shifts, that perhaps his exhausted brain had conjured the worst possible scenario. He had tried to build a fragile fortress of denial. Then, the kitchen counter lit up. It was a silent notification. No vibration, no chime, just a harsh, blue-white rectangular glow cutting through the dimness of the room. Kennedy's phone had been left sitting precariously close to the edge of the cheap laminate counter, face up. Chase stopped breathing. The screwdriver slipped from his calloused hand, clattering loudly against the linoleum. He didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he pulled himself up, his knees popping in the quiet room, and stood over the device. He didn't have to unlock it. The notification was sitting right there on the lock screen, a digital dagger plunging straight through his ribs. Brock, the concierge is leaving the key to 412 in an envelope under your name. I can't wait to see you in that dress again. Drive safe. Chase stared at the glowing letters until they blurred, the edges of his vision darkening with a sudden rushing vertigo. The air in his lungs turned to concrete. There was no ambiguity left, no room for exhausted misunderstandings or desperate rationalizations. The phantom scent of expensive cologne and a world he could never afford seemed to suddenly choke the air of their grease-stained kitchen. He reached out, his hand trembling so violently he could barely control his fingers. He didn't touch the glass. He just let his hand hover over it, feeling the faint, residual heat of the battery against his palm. He could throw it against the wall. He could storm into the bathroom, tear back the cheap plastic shower curtain, and demand the absolute truth. He could scream until his throat bled, and the neighbors called the police. But a profound, paralyzing exhaustion washed over him, heavier than any physical labor he had ever endured. If he spoke the words aloud, if he confronted her, it would become irrevocably real. As long as he stayed silent, a microscopic, pathetic fraction of his marriage still existed in the agonizing space between what he knew and what he admitted. The screen went black, plunging the corner of the kitchen back into deep shadows. The water in the bathroom shut off. The squeak of the old plumbing was followed by the familiar slide of the curtain. Chase carefully picked up the screwdriver. He sat back down on the cold floor, positioning himself perfectly in front of the cabinet, just as he had been. When Kennedy walked into the kitchen minutes later, wrapped in a faded white towel, she paused. "Did you fix it?" she asked. Her voice was deliberately light, her eyes entirely avoiding his as she reached for her phone and slipped it seamlessly into the pocket of her wading coat. Chase didn't look up. He stared blindly at the tightened screw, feeling the last remaining foundation of his life quietly shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "Yeah," Chase lied, his voice entirely hollow. "It's fixed." Kennedy stood before the cracked bathroom mirror, applying a shade of lipstick Chase had never seen before. It was a deep crimson, possessing a subtle, expensive sheen that felt entirely alien in their cramped, mildew-scented bathroom. It was far removed from the pale, generic lip balm she usually swiped on before heading to the department store. "Another inventory night," she called out over her shoulder, her voice meticulously casual, perfectly pitched to sound like a complaint. "Don't wait up." Chase sat on the edge of their unmade bed, methodically lacing up his grease-stained work boots. He nodded, staring at the frayed laces, though she couldn't see him. "Drive safe." The lie hung in the apartment like heavy smoke, long after the front door clicked shut. Hours later, the frigid Michigan air bit fiercely through Chase's thin flannel shirt. He stood in the bleak alley behind Hank's 24/7, leaning against the cold brick wall beneath the loudly humming industrial exhaust fan. The smell of rotting cabbage from the overflowing dumpster mixed with the sharp, harsh scent of his burning cigarette. The heavy metal back door groaned open, a gust of warm, oily air escaping into the freezing night. Dan Williams stepped out. He struck a match against the brick, cupping his weathered, scarred hands against the bitter wind to light his own cigarette. "You burnt the hash browns on table 4, Dan said quietly, exhaling a plume of gray smoke into the dark, starless sky. "You never burned the hash browns, Chase. Not in 5 years." Chase stared at the glowing orange cherry of his cigarette. "My mind was somewhere else." "Yeah, it's been somewhere else for 2 weeks." Dan studied him, his deep-set eyes narrowing under the dim, flickering security light. "You look like a man walking to his own execution. What's going on? Is it the rent again? They threatening to evict?" Chase took a long, slow drag. The nicotine did absolutely nothing to steady the violent, persistent trembling deep in his chest. He thought about Kennedy's new crimson lipstick. He thought about the sudden influx of her mandatory overtime that conveniently never reflected on the crumpled pay stubs he used to balance their meager checking account. He thought about the notification from Brock that was permanently branded into his memory. "She's seeing someone," Chase said. The words tasted like copper. It was the absolute first time he had spoken them aloud, and the sheer, crushing gravity of them nearly buckled his knees. Dan stopped mid-inhale. The older man slowly lowered his cigarette, the lines around his mouth hardening into stone. "You sure? Or are you just letting the stress and the shifts get into your head?" "I saw a message on her phone," Chase replied, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of the exhaust fan. "A hotel room. A guy named Brock. She dresses up for him now, puts on perfume just to say she's counting inventory in a warehouse." Dan swore softly under his breath, kicking a stray pebble into the darkness. Son of a bitch. He looked at Chase, a fierce, protective anger abruptly flaring in his tired eyes. "So what the hell are you doing standing out here freezing in an alley? You go home. You pack her bags. You change the locks. You confront her, Chase." Chase shook his head slowly, pressing the back of his skull against the freezing brick, as if trying to ground himself. "If I say it, if I look her in the eye and tell her I know, it's over. The second I open my mouth, 10 years of my life, every promise we ever made, just vanishes into thin air. It becomes real." "It's already real, kid," Dan said gently, dropping his cigarette and grinding it out with the heavy heel of his boot. "The house is burning down around you. Refusing to look at the smoke doesn't mean you aren't going to turn to ash." Chase closed his eyes against the stinging wind. He knew Dan was right. The logic was inescapable and brutal. But the terror of that final, irreversible confrontation, the impending moment when the woman he loved would be forced to look at him and admit she had actively chosen a different life, was a paralyzing poison in his veins. He simply wasn't ready to pull the trigger on his own heart. The heater in the 1998 Honda Civic had died 3 winters ago, leaving the cramped cabin smelling perpetually of damp upholstery and cold dust. Chase sat in the driver's seat, the engine killed, parked in the darkest, furthest corner of the sprawling mall parking lot. Outside, the freezing Detroit rain fell in relentless, heavy sheets, blurring the amber glow of the sodium street lamps into smudged halos. It was 7:45 p.m. Kennedy had told him the mandatory inventory count began exactly at 8. Chase's hands gripped the freezing plastic of the steering wheel until his joints ached. He had called in sick to Hank's 24/7 for the first time in his life, an act that felt almost as foreign and deeply wrong to him as spying on his own wife. He kept telling himself he was here to prove Dan wrong. He was here to see Kennedy walk back into that depressing concrete building with a clipboard, proving that the hotel room text was some horrible, elaborate misunderstanding, a sick joke, anything but the truth. At 7:52 p.m., the heavy glass employee exit doors swung open. A few retail workers trudged out into the rain, their shoulders slumped in exhaustion, pulling thin coats over their generic uniforms as they hurried toward the distant employee parking section. Chase leaned forward, holding his breath, frantically wiping the condensation from the inside of his windshield with his flannel sleeve. Then she appeared. Kennedy didn't look like a woman preparing for 4 hours of counting barcode stickers in a dusty stockroom. She had shed the cheap, required navy blazer. Instead, she wore a sleek beige trench coat, belted tightly at her waist, and the hem of a striking crimson dress peeked out just above her knees. She was holding a large black umbrella, carefully shielding her freshly styled hair from the downpour. Chase's heart performed a slow, agonizing drop into his stomach. He recognized the red dress. He had bought it for her 3 anniversaries ago, from a department store clearance rack, back when they still had the energy to celebrate things. She hadn't worn it for him in years. She didn't walk toward the bus stop or her usual parking zone. She stood at the curb beneath the harsh awning light, shifting her weight slightly, her posture entirely different than the defeated slump she carried through their apartment. There was a nervous, electric anticipation radiating from her, evident in the quick, eager way she checked her phone screen. 2 minutes later, a black Mercedes S-Class glided silently to the curb, its sleek, immaculate body repelling the dirty city rain like liquid glass. The powerful LED headlights swept across the wet asphalt, briefly illuminating the rusted hood of Chase's Civic before settling directly on Kennedy. Chase couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The air in his car had turned to an absolute vacuum. The passenger door of the Mercedes popped open from the inside. Kennedy leaned down slightly to look into the cabin. The warm, ambient amber light from the luxury dashboard illuminated her face perfectly through the darkness. She smiled. It wasn't the tight, fragile, apologetic smile she offered Chase across the laminate table of the diner. It was a radiant, breathless, and entirely surrendered smile, a look of pure, unadulterated escape. She smoothly folded her umbrella, slid into the rich leather interior of the sedan, and pulled the heavy door shut. The solid, expensive thud seemed to echo across the empty parking lot, vibrating right through the glass of Chase's windshield and into his chest. The Mercedes pulled away with effortless grace, its bright red taillights bleeding into the rain-slicked asphalt, quickly disappearing into the chaotic rhythm of the city traffic. Chase remained in the freezing car, completely engulfed by the shadows. He didn't scream. He didn't slam his fists against the steering wheel or reach for the ignition to chase them down. He simply sat there in the deafening hollow silence, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof, feeling the exact, precise moment the life he had known quietly and permanently ceased to exist. The rusted hinges of the apartment door whined softly, a sound Chase usually tried to muffle when coming home from the late shift so he wouldn't wake her. Tonight, he let it drag. The apartment was entirely dark, save for the pale, yellow beam of a street lamp slicing through the cheap plastic blinds. The air inside felt stagnant, heavy with the smell of stale coffee, the lemon-scented floor cleaner Kennedy always bought on sale, and the faint, ghostly trail of the expensive floral perfume she had worn specifically for another man. Chase didn't turn on the overhead lights. He didn't need to. He knew every crack in the linoleum, every scuff on the baseboards, every physical manifestation of their shared, exhausting struggle. He walked straight into the bedroom and pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the cramped closet. The zipper caught halfway, a stubborn snag he had meant to fix for years. He tugged it forcefully, the metallic sound ripping violently through the suffocating silence of the room. Packing 10 years of a life took less than 15 minutes. He bypassed the things they had bought together, the small television they had saved up for over 6 months, the thrift store armchair they had painstakingly reupholstered on the living room floor, the ceramic coffee pot that was currently keeping the diner smell alive in the kitchen. He took only what belonged strictly to the man he was before the rot had set in: 3 pairs of work jeans, a handful of faded flannel shirts, his heavy winter coat, and his shaving kit. The bag wasn't even full. It was a terrifyingly light burden for a decade of promises. He stood in the center of the bedroom, his heavy boots silent against the thin, worn carpet. A part of him, a dark, primal corner of his mind, wanted to tear the room apart. He wanted to shatter the vanity mirror she had looked into while carefully applying that crimson lipstick. He wanted to take a knife to the cheap mattress where she had lain next to him in the dark, silently calculating her escape. But the anger wouldn't come. It was completely smothered beneath a thick, heavy blanket of absolute exhaustion. Smashing plates wouldn't unsend the hotel room text message. Tearing sheets wouldn't erase the permanent, burned-in image of her sliding into the warm, amber glow of the Mercedes. Instead, Chase knelt on the floor and reached deep under the bed, pulling out a battered Nike shoebox. It was their makeshift vault, holding expired passports, old lease agreements, and photographs from a time before the grinding weight of their minimum wage existence had slowly crushed the breath out of them. He sifted through the loose papers until his rough, calloused fingers brushed against glossy paper. He pulled it out. It was a candid Polaroid from the Tuesday afternoon they had gone down to the downtown courthouse. They hadn't been able to afford a real wedding, or even a modest dinner afterward. It had been raining that day too, a sudden, unseasonal Detroit downpour. In the photograph, they were huddled together beneath a violently yellow, flimsy convenience store umbrella. Chase's hair was plastered to his forehead, and Kennedy's mascara was slightly smudged from the dampness, but she was looking up at him with a smile so wide, so fiercely alive, and entirely devoted, that it looked like it could have powered the entire city block. He stared at the uncorrupted ghost of his wife in the dim light. He traced the edge of the white border with his thumb, feeling a single, jagged tear run hot against his freezing cheek. Chase walked slowly back into the kitchen. He placed the photograph squarely in the center of the scratched laminate table, precisely on the exact spot where her phone had rested 2 nights ago. He didn't write a note. There was no poetry left to bleed onto paper, no furious accusations that wouldn't sound pathetic and hollow in the empty room. The photograph said everything that needed to be said. It was the irrefutable proof of the sacred, fragile thing she had willingly slaughtered for a ride in a luxury sedan. He unclipped his apartment key from his brass carabiner and set it gently next to the picture. Chase picked up the duffel bag, the canvas strap biting sharply into his shoulder. He walked out the door, pulling it shut until the deadbolt clicked firmly into place, and stepped back out into the freezing, relentless rain, leaving the ghost of his marriage behind him. The pale gray light of dawn was just beginning to bleed through the rain-streaked windows when Kennedy turned her key in the apartment door. The metallic click sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. She slipped inside, holding her breath, her movements slow and calculated. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that had settled into her muscles, but her skin still hummed with the residual electricity of the night spent in room 412. The smell of expensive hotel sheets and Brock's sandalwood cologne still clung to her hair. She carefully hung her beige trench coat on the hook by the door, slipping out of her heels to avoid making the floorboards creak. It was 6:15 a.m. Chase usually had the coffee pot sputtering by now, the harsh scent of generic dark roast filling the cramped space before he left for his morning shift. But the air was entirely still. It was cold, carrying only the faint, stale odor of lemon cleaner and old cooking grease. "Chase?" she whispered, the word feeling strange and fragile in her throat. There was no answer. She walked softly down the narrow hallway, her stockinged feet gliding over the peeling linoleum. She peeked into the bedroom, bracing herself for the sight of him asleep, or perhaps sitting on the edge of the mattress, tired and unknowing. The bed was perfectly made. It hadn't been slept in. A sharp, sudden spike of anxiety pierced through her chest, momentarily piercing the warm, insulated bubble of her night with Brock. She stepped fully into the room. The closet door was slightly ajar. She walked over, her breathing growing shallow, and pulled it open. His heavy winter coat was gone. The faded canvas duffel bag that usually sat on the top shelf was missing. Panic, cold and sharp as cracked glass, began to rise in her throat. She spun around, rushing back into the small kitchen, flipping on the harsh overhead fluorescent light. That was when she saw it. Sitting dead center on the scratched laminate table, illuminated directly beneath the buzzing bulb, was a single piece of glossy paper and a brass apartment key. Kennedy walked toward the table as if moving underwater. The edges of her vision blurred. She didn't need to pick up the photograph to know what it was. The image of the two of them, huddled beneath that garish yellow umbrella in the pouring rain, laughing with an innocent, uncorrupted joy that felt like it belonged to a different century, stared back at her. There was no angry letter. There were no smashed plates or torn clothes, just the quiet, devastating proof of what she had traded away. She reached out, her fingers trembling violently, and touched the smooth surface of the Polaroid. The memory of that day, the smell of the damp asphalt, the way Chase had wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, the absolute certainty she had felt that they would survive anything as long as they were together, crashed into her with the force of a physical blow. Her knees weakened, and she slumped into one of the mismatched wooden chairs, pressing her hand over her mouth to stifle a sudden, tearing sob. He knew. He had known, and he had simply walked away, leaving the entire, crushing weight of the destruction squarely on her shoulders. In the suffocating silence of the kitchen, her purse began to vibrate. The dull buzz seemed to shake the floorboards. Kennedy pulled her phone from her bag, her eyes blurry with tears. The screen glowed brightly, cutting through the dimness of the room. "Brock, thinking about you. I know going back to that place is hard. But you won't be there much longer. You belong with me. You deserve the world, Kennedy." She stared at the text. The words were a lifeline, thrown into a raging, terrifying ocean of guilt. She looked from the glowing screen back to the photograph on the table. The contrast was absolute. The photo represented a life of relentless struggle, of counted pennies, grease-stained shirts, and a love that hadn't been enough to pay the heating bill. The phone in her hand represented escape, luxury, and a man who looked at her like she was a prize to be kept. Kennedy closed her eyes, inhaling a shaky breath. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, smudging her expensive makeup. She carefully picked up the Polaroid, avoiding looking directly at Chase's smiling face, and slid it into the back of a junk drawer, pushing it out of sight beneath unpaid utility bills and takeout menus. She wasn't going to drown in this kitchen. She typed a quick reply to Brock, ignoring the hollow, echoing sensation in her chest, and turned her back on the empty apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor penthouse offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Detroit skyline, a sprawling grid of golden streetlights and red taillights cutting through the freezing November darkness. 2 years ago, this view had felt like a triumphant conquest, a shimmering reward for finally choosing herself and stepping out of the agonizing grind of poverty. Tonight, it just felt like the thick glass walls of a very expensive aquarium. Kennedy stood completely still by the glass, a crystal tumbler of sparkling water warming in her hand. She wore a silk slip dress that Brock had chosen for her, champagne-colored, smooth, and perpetually cold against her skin. She had learned early on that Brock preferred her in neutral tones, things that didn't clash with the minimalist, sterile aesthetic of his carefully curated life. The digital clock embedded in the marble kitchen island clicked to 11:30 p.m. A heavy, suffocating quiet hung over the massive apartment. It was a completely different brand of silence than the one she had shared with Chase. The quiet in her old life had been born of sheer exhaustion, a heavy, shared burden of physical survival that left them both too tired to speak. This silence was hollow and deliberate. It was the manufactured isolation of a woman who was technically a girlfriend, but practically a ghost. Brock rarely took her to his high society company dinners. She was his private escape, neatly tucked away in this high-rise, far removed from his wealthy, influential circles. The electronic lock on the front door beeped sharply, snapping her out of her reverie. Brock stepped into the vast foyer, shrugging off a tailored cashmere overcoat. He looked impeccably sharp, though a faint shadow of fatigue darkened his eyes. He didn't offer a greeting, merely tossing his heavy leather briefcase onto a modern, glass console table. "You're still up," he noted, walking toward the sleek, built-in bar to pour himself a scotch. His tone was observational, entirely devoid of the hungry, validating warmth that had lured her out of her retail uniform 2 years prior. "I was waiting for you," Kennedy said quietly, setting her glass down and moving away from the window. "You said you'd be done with the quarterly review dinner by 9. Things ran late," he replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of the amber liquid. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, toward the glowing city. A client needed extra handling. You know how it is. As he set the heavy glass down and moved toward the master bedroom, pulling at his silk tie, Kennedy stepped closer to the console table. His suit jacket was draped carelessly over the edge of a velvet chair. The scent hit her before she even consciously registered what it was. It wasn't his usual spiced sandalwood and leather. It was floral. Heavy, sweet, and distinctly synthetic. Jasmine mixed with cheap vanilla. It smelled exactly like the fluorescent-lit cosmetic counter she had so desperately clawed her way out of. Her breath hitched, a sudden, icy knot forming tight in her stomach. She stared at the dark wool of the jacket. The collar was slightly rumpled, bearing the faintest smudge of pale foundation. She didn't need to check his phone. She didn't need to wait until he was asleep to find a hotel address or a digital confirmation. The devastating, humiliating truth hung heavily in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the penthouse. The intoxicating magnetic charm Brock had used to dismantle her marriage wasn't a unique, once-in-a-lifetime passion reserved solely for her. It was simply his strategy. It was a well-rehearsed routine he used to acquire beautiful, struggling things. "Are you coming to bed?" Brock called out from down the long hallway, his voice carrying the lazy, entitled expectation of a man who assumed the world would always wait for him. Kennedy looked around the massive, perfectly clean room. There were no photographs of them anywhere. There were no shared struggles, no inside jokes, no history. Just expensive furniture and a view that was slowly making her dizzy. The realization crashed into her with the brutal, unforgiving weight of a collapsing building. She had willingly destroyed a flawed, struggling man who would have bled to keep her warm, all to become a temporary, replaceable fixture in a life that was fundamentally empty. "In a minute," she whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling as the heavy doors of the gilded cage finally locked around her. The end, when it finally arrived, possessed none of the fiery, dramatic passion that had ignited the affair. It was surgical, brief, and ruthlessly polite. Brock had stood in the center of the penthouse kitchen, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, checking his Rolex as he delivered the final verdict. "My board is pushing for a family-oriented image this quarter, Kennedy. My wife and I are renewing our vows. This has run its course. I'll have my assistant wire you enough for a deposit on a new place." He hadn't even looked her in the eye. She was simply an expired lease, a liability neatly written off the ledger of his perfectly curated life. 6 weeks later, Kennedy sat on a bare, stained mattress in a third-floor studio apartment in Southfield. The radiator in the corner clanked violently, spitting out a meager, metallic heat that did nothing to cut the bitter January draft seeping through the single-pane window. Outside, the view was a depressing brick wall and an overflowing industrial dumpster. She pulled a thick, thrift store sweater tighter around her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cheap instant coffee. Her feet throbbed with a dull, familiar agony. She had just finished a 9-hour shift at a discount pharmacy chain, standing behind a plastic cash register, scanning generic cough syrup and cheap toilet paper. It was a brutal, humiliating step down from the polished glass counters of the department store she had once complained about so bitterly. There was no artisan coffee here, no subtle compliments from wealthy men. Only the harsh, buzzing glare of dying fluorescent tubes and the impatient sighs of exhausted customers. She had traded a struggling marriage for a gilded cage, and now the gold had flaked away, leaving her in a cage of her own making, one that was smaller, colder, and infinitely more lonely than the life she had abandoned. Kennedy set the mug down on the floor, the ceramic making a dull thud against the warped laminate. She looked around the small, cramped room. Cardboard boxes, scavenged from the back alley of the pharmacy, were stacked haphazardly in the corner. She hadn't found the energy to fully unpack. There was no point in decorating a space that felt entirely like a prison cell. In the apartment she had shared with Chase, the poverty had been oppressive, but it had been shared. The worn armchair had been a place where they tangled their legs together while watching bad television. The smell of burnt diner coffee had been a comforting anchor, signaling that he was home, safe, and working himself to the bone just to keep a roof over their heads. He had loved her with a quiet, desperate ferocity that she had fundamentally failed to understand until it was entirely gone. The silence of this new room was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that forced her to sit alone with her own thoughts. She reached into one of the open boxes, pulling out a stack of folded clothes to put away in the flimsy particle board dresser. As she lifted a heavy winter sweater, a small, worn book slipped from between the folds. It was a paperback copy of a romance novel she had bought years ago at a thrift store. It hit the floor with a flat smack. From between the yellowed pages, a single, glossy square of paper slid out, landing face up on the dusty laminate floor. Kennedy froze. The breath hitched violently in her throat, refusing to move past her ribs. The clanking of the radiator seemed to fade into a hollow static. Staring up at her, illuminated by the harsh, unshaded bulb of the ceiling light, was the Polaroid photograph. Chase, laughing with uncorrupted joy beneath a bright yellow umbrella, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the entire world. She hadn't looked at it since the morning she found it on the kitchen table. She had hidden it away, burying it deep in her belongings, terrified of the silent judgment it carried. But here, in the freezing, absolute zero of her new reality, there was nowhere left to hide. The photograph lay perfectly flat against the dusty laminate floor, its glossy surface reflecting the harsh, unshaded glare of the single ceiling bulb. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the cramped studio apartment was the violent metallic clanking of the radiator and the ragged, shallow intake of Kennedy's own breathing. She stared down at the small square of paper as if it were an unexploded bomb. It was a relic from a timeline she had violently severed. There they were, frozen forever under that ridiculous, bright yellow convenience store umbrella. The Detroit rain was pouring down around them, but the camera flash had illuminated Chase's face just as he looked down at her. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his jawline shadowed with exhaustion from working back-to-back diner shifts, but his eyes were bright, fierce, and entirely consumed by her. He was looking at her, as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Kennedy's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hard floor, the cheap particle board of the dresser scraping against her shoulder, but she barely felt the impact. Her trembling fingers reached out, hovering over the image before finally pressing against the cold, smooth surface. She traced the white border, her thumb brushing over the faded timestamp in the corner. The contrast between the woman in the photograph and the woman sitting on the floor was absolute. The girl under the umbrella had been perpetually exhausted, her bank account overdrawn, her feet blistered from the cosmetic counter, but she had been incredibly, fiercely loved. She had possessed a sanctuary in the shape of a man who would have gladly burned the world down to keep her warm. The woman sitting on the floor now had nothing. The realization did not arrive as a gentle wave. It crashed down on her like a collapsed roof. The suffocating, sterile penthouse, the expensive champagne-colored slip dresses, the scent of Brock's sandalwood cologne mixed with cheap floral perfume on his collar, it all rushed back, mocking her. She hadn't traded her difficult life for a better one. She had traded a man who saw her soul for a man who only saw a temporary, depreciating asset. A guttural, ugly sound tore its way out of Kennedy's throat, a sound she didn't even recognize as her own. It was a raw, primal sob of absolute devastation. She pulled the photograph to her chest, curling her body inward until her forehead pressed against her cold knees. The dam she had meticulously built over the past 2 years, the delicate architecture of justifications, the lies she told herself about needing to escape the poverty, the hollow comfort of the luxury car, and the high-rise view, finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She wept for the smell of stale diner coffee she would never wake up to again. She wept for the calloused, grease-stained hands that used to gently massage her aching feet after a 10-hour shift. But mostly, she wept for the terrifying, permanent knowledge that she had been handed something incredibly rare and beautiful, and she had willingly, deliberately dropped it into a meat grinder just to see if the gears were made of gold. The frigid draft from the poorly sealed window swept over the floorboards, cutting through her thin thrift store sweater. Kennedy squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the Polaroid so tightly its edges began to crease in her grip. In the crushing silence of the studio apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the bleak reality of her minimum-wage existence, the ghost of Chase Parker felt more real than she did. She was finally, entirely alone, a prisoner trapped in the wreckage of her own catastrophic choices. The Detroit transit bus groaned to a halt, its air brakes hissing sharply against the freezing February night. Kennedy stepped off the heavy rubber tread and onto the sleet-covered sidewalk. She pulled the thin collar of her thrift store coat up around her neck, shivering violently as the damp cold immediately sank into her bones. She hadn't been back to this working-class neighborhood in over 2 years. The cracked pavement, the flickering street lamps, the distant, relentless hum of the nearby freeway, it all felt like a past life, a museum exhibit of a world she had deliberately burned to the ground. A block ahead, the neon sign of Hank's 24/7 sputtered against the dark, starless sky, casting a bruised purple and red halo over the wet asphalt. She didn't cross the street. She stayed on the opposite corner, hiding in the deep, freezing shadow of a boarded-up pawn shop. The rain was picking up, turning into a biting sleet that stung her cheeks, but she barely registered the physical discomfort. Her eyes were entirely fixed on the wide, grease-smudged front window of the diner. It was exactly as she remembered. The harsh fluorescent lights, the faded vinyl booths, the stainless steel counter that she knew smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. And then she saw him. Chase was standing behind the counter. He wore the same style of white apron, though it looked distinctly less stained, layered over a thick flannel shirt. He looked older. There was a subtle scattering of silver in his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes were etched a fraction deeper. But the suffocating, bone-deep exhaustion that used to weigh down his shoulders, the heavy burden of their shared poverty that she had so deeply despised, was entirely gone. His posture was upright, relaxed. He was wiping down the laminate counter, pausing to say something to Dan Williams, who was leaning casually against the pie display case. Dan threw his head back and laughed, clapping Chase on the shoulder with a heavy, affectionate hand. Then, a woman walked out from the swinging kitchen doors pushing a gray plastic bus tub. She had warm, tired eyes and wore a simple green waitress uniform. She bumped her hip playfully against Chase's as she squeezed past him in the narrow aisle. Chase turned, a sudden bright smile breaking across his face. It wasn't the fragile, desperate smile he used to give Kennedy when he was trying to convince her they would figure out the electric bill. It was an easy, deeply grounded smile. The woman set the tub down and rested her hand gently on his forearm for just a second longer than necessary. Chase didn't pull away. He leaned ever so slightly into the touch, his eyes soft, entirely present in the warmth of the moment. Standing in the freezing sleet, a pane of glass and a lifetime away, Kennedy felt the last remaining shard of her ego violently shatter. During her darkest, most pathetic nights on the floor of her studio apartment, a small, twisted part of her had clung to the belief that her departure had ruined him. She had desperately wanted to believe that the love they shared was so profound, so singular, that losing it would leave him permanently hollow, just as she was. But he wasn't a ghost. He had rebuilt his life from the silent ashes she had left on their kitchen table. He had survived the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her exit. The wreckage, she finally understood, with absolute crushing clarity, was entirely contained within her own chest. She pressed her freezing bare hands over her mouth, stifling a ragged, agonizing breath. The golden warmth radiating from the diner window felt like a physical barrier, a bright, living world she had permanently exiled herself from. She had taken 2 buses in the freezing rain, looking for some twisted form of closure, an apology she could offer to ease the suffocating weight of her own guilt. But looking at the quiet, steady contentment in Chase's eyes, the most devastating truth of all finally landed. He didn't need her apology. He had simply, gracefully, moved on. The freezing rain had slowly transitioned into heavy, wet snow, the large flakes catching the neon glow of the diner's sign, before melting instantly against the freezing concrete. Kennedy stood perfectly still in the shadows, letting the bitter wind bite through her thin coat. Through the condensation-streaked glass of Hank's 24/7, she watched the man she had promised to love for a lifetime pour a fresh cup of coffee. Chase handed the mug to the woman in the green uniform. She whispered something that made him smile, a quiet, effortless expression of domestic peace that Kennedy hadn't seen on his face in years. He looked settled. He looked like a man who had walked through a blazing fire and miraculously found solid ground on the other side. Kennedy's frozen fingers dug deep into the pocket of her coat, wrapping tightly around the worn, slightly bent edges of the Polaroid photograph. She could cross the street. She could push open those heavy glass doors, let the warm air and the smell of industrial cleaner wash over her, and force him to look at her. She could fall apart in one of those cracked vinyl booths, beg for his forgiveness, and tell him how completely and utterly wrong she had been. But as she watched him wipe down the counter, moving with a calm certainty she had never appreciated, a sudden, blinding clarity pierced through her grief. To cross that street wouldn't be an act of love. It would be a final, unforgivable act of selfishness. She had already taken his youth, his trust, and his dignity. She had no right to take his peace. Slowly, deliberately, Kennedy took a step backward. Her cheap boots slipped slightly on the slush-covered pavement, but she steadied herself, melting further into the dense, icy shadows of the boarded-up pawn shop. She turned her back on the golden, glowing window. The walk to the bus stop was agonizingly long. The wind coming off the Detroit River howled through the empty streets, carrying the harsh, metallic scent of the city's exhaust and freezing water. When the heavy transit bus finally arrived, its doors opening with a weary sigh, she climbed aboard. The cabin was nearly empty, illuminated by harsh, flickering overhead lights that made the dirty linoleum floor look even more depressing. Kennedy moved to a seat in the very back, curling into the corner next to a fogged-up window. The heater beneath the seat was broken, blowing only cold, stale air against her damp ankles. As the bus lurched forward, pulling her further and further away from the only real home she had ever known, she pulled her hand from her pocket. The Polaroid rested in her trembling palm. In the dim, unforgiving light of the bus, the yellow convenience store umbrella looked faded, and the smiles on their young faces felt like a cruel optical illusion from a parallel universe. Chase hadn't left the photograph on their kitchen table out of spite. He hadn't left it to punish her. He had left it as a mirror, a silent testament to the sacred, fragile thing she was abandoning. It had simply taken her 2 years, a gilded cage, and the absolute destruction of her pride to finally be able to look into it. She gently brushed her thumb over Chase's smiling face, feeling a fresh, hot tear slip down her freezing cheek, dropping silently onto the glossy paper. There would be no dramatic rescue, no sudden reconciliation, and no wealthy savior to whisk her away from the consequences of her actions. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a freezing studio apartment, put on a generic pharmacy uniform, and stand on her aching feet beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. She would do it completely alone. Kennedy rested her head against the vibrating glass of the bus window, clutching the photograph tightly to her chest. It was the only thing she had left in the world, a small, square, permanent reminder of the heavy, inescapable toll of betrayal.